I'm going to be teaching you all you need to know as to how to be able to create this kind of image you're seeing. I get lots of questions asking, how do you get a blur background in your video? And that is exactly what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So to get a blur background, there are some few major things you need to take note of. We are going to be talking about the sensor size, the type of lens, and the distance between your camera, your subject, and your background. These are the major things we are going to be dealing with. So just sit back, relax, because as always, this is a very quick and easy one. So first of all, let's talk about the camera. This right here is an APS-C sensor camera. And because the size of this sensor isn't that huge, on paper, you are not going to be getting so much light hitting this particular sensor because it's a very small sized one. Unlike if you're using a full frame camera, which has a very big sensor. So on paper, this is not an option if you really want to have a blur background. So if you're thinking of getting a camera that will let you get so much blur background, then do not buy an APS-C or a Micro Four Thirds. You did realize that I said on paper because trust me, most of the modern APS-C sensors and Micro Four Thirds sensors do wonders. So that's why I said on paper, but on practice these days is totally different because of how far technology has come. However, to keep this at the basic level, all you need to know is that the larger the sensor, the more light your camera can let in and the more you can have a blur background. The next important tip here is having a very good lens which is capable of giving you a blur background. Now, how to determine if your lens can actually blur the background very well is by checking something called the f-stop or the f number. On this particular lens here is f1.4. Now, the f-stop number is actually calculated using a descending order and not an ascending order. What do I mean by that? An f1.4 would give you much more light than, let's say, an f12. So instead of doing f1, f2, f3, f4, f5, f5 is actually darker image and f1 is actually a very bright image. That's how it is. I know this might sound confusing at first, but if you keep doing this, it's going to get very easy. So f1.4 means a very wide opening, and that's how far this lens can go. So it means if I use this on a camera, I'll be able to blur the background very well because I can let more light into the camera. You need to keep in mind that we are able to blur the background because we are allowing more light into the camera, thereby allowing the camera to know what is our subject and what is our background. Basically, that is just the reason why we are able to blur our background. So a lens like this would give us much more opportunity to be able to blur the background. And this is actually a prime lens. Now, before we end the video, I'm going to be talking about zoom lenses because those also exist in another whole world of their own. So basically, just make sure that the lens you are getting always have a very low f-stop number like 1.4. If you have, let's say, a lens with, let's say, f6.5 or let's say f12, that is a total no-go if you want a blur background. F10, F whatever, that is a no. But the lower the number keeps coming, so imagine what an F0.5 would look like. I mean, that is almost like the camera can see in darkness. I mean, that is crazy. So just keep that in mind. The lower the number, the higher the opening or the more powerful the lens is in terms of being able to allow more light into the camera. If you increase your f-stop, let's say this one that can do 1.4, if we take it all the way to 1.4, it's going to be so bright that we need an ND filter which will act like a sunglasses for your camera. So we put it in front here. It's like a dark surface for it to cut down the light so that you can have a normal exposure. If you can't get an ND filter to cut down the light, you can therefore increase your shutter speed. So as you can see in this particular video right now, I'm cranking up the shutter speed so that it will cut down the amount of light which is getting into the camera. Now, this isn't a very good practice because once you increase the shutter speed, then you're losing the natural motion blur that you have in the image, which it's not really very good, especially when it comes to cinema. So you need to take very keen note of that if you really want to be using those creamy backgrounds in your video. If you are doing photography, it's different. You might not need an ND, but if you're doing video and you want to be able to use your lens to the highest capacity, then you certainly and mostly need to have this ND filter. The last point on the list is the distance between your camera and the subject and the background. Now, let's take a look at this particular example. At this particular side, as you can see, although my aperture is wide open, I'm shooting almost at f1.4, I'm still not able to blur the background because the camera is close to the subject and the subject is very close to the background, as you can see in that garden. So we are not able to blur the background completely, despite the fact that our camera sensor is large and even our lens is still shooting at f1.4. And so what do we do? How do we get rid of this? By moving both our subject and our camera far away from the background. Now, this is how the shot looks like. As you can see, it's still the same camera, the same lens. However, we are able to blur the background because the subject is not completely very close to the background. So for example, if you are very close to a wall and you still even open up your lens to, let's say, even 0.5, f0.5, the background will still not be blurred because your subject is too close. So move them away from the background and you can blur the background. Now, before we end this video, earlier on I spoke about zoom lenses being in a different league. Now, because zoom lenses can zoom in, they behave differently. So even if I have a zoom lens or I use a zoom lens which doesn't really have, let's say, an f1.4, but if it can zoom in, you can see that we can have a totally blurred background. For example, in this case, we have this particular lens here, and this lens is 75 to 300 millimeters, and it's just f5.6, f5.6, and you realize that this is f1.4. This is a very powerful lens than this. But however, because this can zoom in all the way through, when we use a distance theory here, then this can still give us a blur because it will be able to zoom in from a distance. The other thing you need to take note of is that if you're using a zoom lens, every single motion becomes magnified, because remember, from that distance, look at the distance where I am shooting from right now. From that particular distance, once you touch the camera, every little micro shake becomes so accentuated. As you can see, just a little touch, then the camera begins to shake all over the place just because you've zoomed in from a distance. So that is something you clearly need to take very key note of. And also, just look at both of these images on the screen, then you realize that using the prime lens or the prime lens, the images kind of look a little bit much more sharper than those coming from the zoom lens, despite the fact that the zoom lens was also still able to blur the background. So if you look closely, one is sharper than the other. The sharper one is from the prime lens, and the one which is a little bit blurred, even at the places where you need them to be sharp, is actually the zoom lens. I don't know if this makes sense. Like I said, these things just need much more practice, and trust me, once you keep doing them, you're going to understand them. They might seem difficult at first, but constant practice, you will get very used to them. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you are just discovering this video for the very first time, welcome. This is Africa Amaze channel, where we talk about cinematography, photography, editing, and all its related branches. If you do have any further questions, you can link me up on Instagram at obl_junior. DM me your questions and I will gladly respond to every single one of your messages. Alternatively, if you have any further questions, you can leave them in the comment section below and I'll gladly respond to every single one of your messages as well. And before you go, do me a favor, please make sure to click on the like button, because it goes a long way in helping other people discover this channel right here on YouTube. And before we end this video, if you want to learn more about cameras and editing and shooting with just one camera, I have a video here which will teach you how to do exactly that. Until next time, as always, keep practicing filmmaking. As I go off to see the doctor to fix my broken arm. See you in the next video. Peace out.